The mysteries of the Earth have captured the imagination of humankind since the dawn of civilization. Even today, with scientific and technological advancement, these questions of the unknown continue to challenge our perception of what we call reality. My name is George Popov. I'm a writer-director, and I've spent most of my life creating make-believe stories, trying to find the truth through telling lies, and continuing the same legacy of folklore and legends that have been passed down for thousands of years. But for some of those tales, truth and lies do not relate in such a simple equation. When the line between fact and fiction is enshrouded in mist and shadow, beyond that threshold is a place that can change our perspective on everything we think we know. I call this place the Sideworld. The otherworldly song of the sea has always called to those on land. Since the dawn of humanity, mankind has looked on the ocean with awe and wonder, a seemingly infinite horizon of endless possibilities. For thousands of years, since man first sailed the waves, the vast open ocean has been a gateway to the unknown and unexplored regions of the world. The sea is most likely mankind's first real test of our desire for discovery. However, where great galleons sail, unforgiving winds and thunderous waves strive to deter them, often decimating ships and leaving their scattered remains wrecked on the shores from whence they came. All while underneath the surface beasts dwell in the deep dark waters, waiting to claim the lives of the arrogant invaders. Can man and sea ever truly coexist in harmony? And what terrible fates await creatures venturing from both sides into each other's cruel and unforgiving territories?
July 11th, at 4 a.m., the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. A strange red light of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light, the mast, spars and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief. The lookout reported her as close to the port bow, where also the officer of the watch clearly saw her, who was sent forward at once to the forecastle. But, on arriving there, no vestige nor any sign whatever of any material ship was to be seen, either near or right away to the horizon, the night being clear and the sea calm. 13 persons altogether saw her, but whether it was Van Diemen or the Flying Dutchman or who else must remain unknown.
When one utters the word ghost, the immediate thought is one of ominous uncertainty, a fleeting glimpse of a foggy apparition, or a faded spectre in the corner of a dark room. However, Ghost Ship evokes an entirely different scale of unexplained phenomena. Few can imagine the grand spectacle of witnessing a historical seafaring vessel in all of its glory, looming out of the thick mist on the high sea, its crew lost forever, stranded in a certain point of time. These phantom ships are the epitome of mystery, fear, and wonder, with sightings spanning back centuries. Maritime lore is rife with stories about ghost ships, whether they're sudden apparitions that bewilder witnesses before vanishing into thin air, or mysterious vessels found sailing the oceans with no one aboard. The most famous ship in the latter category is likely to be the Mary Celeste, discovered near the Azores in 1872, void of life, its crew nowhere to be found. However, the former category offers a far more striking visual spectacle, one that transcends explanation and spirals into the realm of the paranormal, with the most well-known example being the infamous Flying Dutchman. The history of man's voyages on the sea is steeped in folklore and superstitions, with a belief in omens and the supernatural common among seafaring folk. It is widely thought the witnessing of a phantom ship was the ultimate symbol of doom and misfortune. Some of the most striking instances of alleged ghost ships takes us to Kent, England, with recurring sightings that have chilled the bones of locals for decades. Many have reported seeing ghostly mirages over the disappearing beach of the notorious Goodwin Sands. The Goodwin Sands is an infamous section of the English Channel, feared by many for its treacherous reputation, also known as the Ship Swallower. The location is a 9-mile stretch that during low tide, as much of a tenth of the total shallow area can be exposed, allowing one to even walk on the sediment. However, for sailors, the rapidly changing weather conditions could easily veer them off course, often leading to vessels being stranded and sometimes destroyed. It is common that ships who attempted to sail through at high tide would be sucked into the sands due to the sediment being displaced. In this instance, the ship's back would be broken and unable to sail once the tide comes back in. On multiple occasions, groups have attempted to erect warning markers on the land, but due to the instability of the terrain, this was never successful. One of the ships to have been decimated on the perilous sands transcends into the realm of the unknown, with an apparition that is said to return to the shores of the Goodwins every 50 years. A distinct 3-masted schooner from the 1700s, named the Lady Lovibond, was wrecked and its entire crew killed. But behind this catastrophic incident is a troubling and tragic tale. On the evening of Friday the 13th of February 1748, after the wedding of the captain, Simon Reed, the Lady Lovibond set off along the River Thames on its way to Portugal. This was a honeymoon voyage of sorts. Below decks, the captain and his new bride Annetta celebrated with the crew, all except for 2. Above deck, keeping a watchful eye over the voyage, was the helmsman, along with the captain's respected right-hand man, the first mate, John Rivers. Rivers had been the best man to Captain Reed. However, he harbored a deep secret. He was in fact madly in love with the captain's beautiful bride, Annetta. As the crew continued to celebrate, jealousy and anger built up inside Rivers, until he could not bear it anymore. As the ship passed the Goodwin Sands, Rivers used a heavy belaying pin from the ship's rail to murder the helmsman, cracking his skull with one heavy blow. He then commandeered the ship, and as his broken heart pounded, he steered the vessel directly onto the sands, killing everyone aboard. The credibility of this story has been questioned due to the devastation of the entire crew. But an inquiry at the time came to the conclusion that the tragedy was a misadventure. This was because of the weather at the time of the wreck, being a clear, stormless night. Therefore, there was no other apparent reason for the tragedy. The mother of John Rivers also gave a statement saying that her son had vowed revenge on Captain Reed, even if it resulted in the loss of his own life. This added to the evidence suggesting that the sinking of the Lovibond was down to foul play. The investigation into the tragic case was closed, but the tale would go on to spawn a new series of mysterious events in the following centuries. In February 1798, exactly 50 years to the day since the Lovibond was destroyed, a ship called the Edenbridge and a small fishing boat passing the Goodwin Sands witnessed what could only be described as a ship that had a striking resemblance to the long-lost Lovibond. A Captain James Westlake recorded in his ship log that they had been close to colliding with the three-masted schooner. He also reported hearing the eerie sounds of a celebration from within the ship, as before his very eyes it broke up and disappeared into the sea. A rescue was attempted, but the team could find no sign of the ship or its passengers. On the 13th of February 1948, exactly 150 years later, locals reported seeing a three-masted ship heading directly towards the visible sands. But yet again, no evidence of any wreckage was discovered. Captain Bull Presswick stated that the ship appeared to be real from his viewpoint. However, he also said that it gave off an unexplainably eerie white glow. The folktales of the ghost ship created so much attention that on the same day in February 1998, many curious onlookers and historians made their way to viewpoints overlooking the Goodwin Sands, ready in wait for the next appearance. Unfortunately, no extraordinary event, supernatural or otherwise, occurred on that day. Although the phantom ship's reappearance doesn't seem to be set in stone, is it still possible for the haunted Lovibond to be on some sort of cycle, with its final moments replaying throughout time? Or are we searching for answers in the wrong place? Perhaps seeing the Lady Lovibond as some sort of cursed paranormal vessel is narrowing our view and actually deflecting the possibility that something even more malevolent lingers in the peculiar 9-mile stretch of the Goodwin Sands. Could the ship swallower itself be the source of these supernatural occurrences? Since the late 1200s, over 1,000 wrecks have been reported in this area, making it a graveyard for ships. Some of these are still visible today, including the Northeastern Victory and the Luray Victory, two American cargo ships that were wrecked as recent as the mid-20th century. In between this wide span of seafaring disasters, none other than the great William Shakespeare referenced the sands in his iconic play The Merchant of Venice in 1598. He wrote, "On the narrow seas, the Goodwins I think they call the place, a very dangerous flat and fatal, where the carcasses of many a tall ship lie buried." Shakespeare was inspired by the striking demise of a Spanish galleon in the location just 10 years prior. The galleon was part of the Armada expedition and was said to have headed into the Goodwins whilst engulfed in flames. Over 100 years later, the area was also the location of one of the biggest disasters in British naval history. An entire fleet of warships, including the Great Northumberland, were demolished after being blown into the sands during one of the worst storms in English history. This led to the complete destruction of 13 ships and over 1,900 men losing their lives. The area around the Goodwin Sands was littered with wreckage and corpses for weeks. There were a handful of survivors that went on to recount the terrible events in detail. However, in these accounts, there were some who claimed to have witnessed an unexplainable sight. In the midst of the carnage and destruction, a Spanish galleon from the times of the Armada, a century before, with ruined sails and fire bellowing from its bow. It was described by the survivors to have sailed right through our ship and finally disappeared before our eyes into the depth of the sands. "50 years later, an East India clipper captain recorded a peculiar sighting, a vessel just off the Goodwins, noting,
"An armed frigate came driving down on my ship, her mast gone, her decks and hull in fearful shape."
As it drew nearer, the crew recognized it as none other than the long-vanished Northumberland, lost in the British naval disaster of 1703. The report continued.
"It was a spectacle far too terrible to dwell upon. To see the ghost of what was once a fine warship going to her doom a second time.
Could the sighting of a second ghost ship in the same location as the Lady Lovibond indicate some greater malevolence is at work in the Goodwins? What if tragedy and destruction opens up a gateway that momentarily allows two worlds to collide, before both are pulled into the sands, doomed to remain, until the cycle begins again? Could some unnatural force exist in the shifting sediments of the Goodwin Sands, like the English Channel's very own Bermuda Triangle? Or perhaps it is the Rio incarnation of Davy Jones's locker, a bit of death that every 50 years allows one of its driftwood victims to resurface for air, only to experience the same torment and suffering that they have endured all those years before. In its often calm and clear waters, is it possible for an evil to lurk beneath the surface of the sea, spawned from all the tragic and terrible events that have taken place there? Some believe that this evil manifests in a very real and monstrous way, crashing into nature to create living, breathing creatures that roam the depths of the vast and open waters. The notion of the sea being an evil realm that houses terrifying beasts has its roots in mythology, with the most well-known being the biblical beast Leviathan, described to be as huge as a whale with dragon-like features. These myths and legends have subsequently inspired great works of art and literature throughout history. In the iconic works of the influential writer H.P. Lovecraft, the sea is seen as a dwelling place for the ancient and cosmic evil that lurks in the universe. His work is full of nightmarish images of monolithic, disfigured monsters with huge tentacles that emerge from the deep to wreak terror on humanity. Most notable of Lovecraft's eerie sea-based creations is a mysterious sunken city called Riley, said to be the prison of the ancient monster god, Cthulhu. However, where fiction ends, reality begins, and for centuries sightings of sea monsters have been reported around the world. Many individuals claim to have spotted a sea monster, but little evidence exists, and sightings with multiple witnesses are few and far between. A particularly well-documented sighting was made on the 6th of August 1848 by the crew of the HMS Daedalus, who during a voyage claimed to have watched a 100-foot serpent for 20 minutes in between the island St. Helena and the Cape of Good Hope. Captain Peter McQuay, in command of the vessel, described the encounter in his official report.
It was discovered to be an enormous serpent, with head and shoulders kept about 4 feet constantly above the surface of the sea, and as nearly as we could approximate by comparing it with the length of what our main topsail yard would show in the water, there was at the very least 60 feet visible, moving through the water, either by vertical or horizontal undulation. It passed rapidly, but so close under our lee quarters that had it been a man of my acquaintance, I should have easily recognized the features with the naked eye.
The reports of the creature very quickly came under fire from prominent scientists, including from biologist Sir Richard Owen, who was the first to coin the phrase dinosaur. Owen suggested that the most likely explanation was that the crew had in fact mistaken an elephant seal swimming in open water. But Captain McQuay strongly rejected these conclusions, angry that his credibility was in question, and stood firm in his assessment of what he had seen. However, as embarrassment began to damage the reputation of the Admiralty, Parliament pressures led to McQuay being put under even more scrutiny for allowing the report to be printed in the first place. McQuay's defiant and determined response was to work with an illustrator to produce a series of engravings depicting the encounter. These were featured in the Illustrated London News, along with a copy of McQuay's report of the encounter, as well as the 3 images portraying the Daedalus sea serpent. The paper also reproduced an anatomical illustration of a previously sighted American sea serpent named Scolioph atlanticus. The edition also included another drawing representing a sighting of a similar creature off the coast of Norway in 1740. The commitment and drive shown by McQuaid to fight his position on the Daedalus sighting could only be seen as a strong indicator for his credibility. Would a respected military captain report such findings if there was any kind of doubt of their reliability, let alone take further measures to combat the great scientific minds at the time? What exactly would a man in McQuaid's position have to gain by hoaxing something that would very likely be met with ridicule? In a pre-photographic age, many occasions in law would rely on detailed illustrations from credible first-hand accounts, as reliability of the witnesses was at the core of any investigation into wrongdoing. The Royal Navy was under strict obligations to ensure its officers had solid states of mind and to be precise in their detailing and not prone to fanciful embellishment. It was also worth noting the state of a mid-19th century Royal Navy was an increasingly scientific body of operations, with key developments in meteorology, weaponry, navigation, and propulsion. The 12 months following the Daedalus sighting produced two potential confirmations. Later in 1848, an American brig reported a similar creature, in almost exactly the same place, between St. Helena and the Cape of Good Hope. And the following year, a Royal Navy sloop made another strikingly similar sighting in the North Atlantic. Skeptics put the array of similar sightings down to a heightened popularity of sea monster stories in the zeitgeist at the time. Do these coincidences stack up in support for this assessment, with reports being fabricated by those looking for media attention? 10 years after the Daedalus sighting, a Captain Smith sighted what he thought was a sea serpent while near the same location as the original sighting. It later turned out to be a 20-foot piece of floating seaweed, with a root shaped like a head and neck. He quickly declared what he saw as a concluding explanation to the Daedalus sighting. However, this was swiftly denied in a letter published in the Times on 13th of February, 1858, from an unnamed crew member of the Daedalus. He wrote,
"The serpent was beyond all question a living creature, moving rapidly through the water in a cross sea, and within 5 points of a fresh breeze, with such velocity that the water was surging under its chest, as it passed along at a rate probably of not less than 10 miles per hour.
The letter was signed simply as an officer of Her Majesty's ship Daedalus. In previous official reports, witnesses had been named, which begs the question if anonymity was adopted because of the growing concern for criticism launched against the Royal Navy. Was this McQuaid writing under new rules, imposed by pressure from the Royal Navy? Or is it more likely that this was another astute officer who also swears by his first-hand encounter with the suspected sea monster? When one individual's account stands against the world of disbelief, can the truth ever rise above the surface? Or will it continue to sink with every passing year? Another incident to see a military vessel coming face to face with a suspected sea monster takes us forward half a century to the First World War in a German U-boat named the SMUB-85. It was on April 30th, 1918, when a British military vessel named the Coreopsis was patrolling off the coast of Belfast in Ireland. In a very unusual event, at midday, the ship discovered a surface German submarine that had somehow been disabled. This was the UB-85. The German crew quickly abandoned their vessel and surrendered, desperate to escape the unstable U-boat. After the German prisoners were safe on board the Coreopsis, the UB-85's commander, Captain Günther Krech, was interrogated. Captain Krech gave an account that his U-boat had surfaced the night prior, in order to recharge its batteries. He described standing in the cold night, getting some fresh air with his men, when a sudden impact rocked the boat. Moments later, a strong, heavy weight pulled down on the bow, dipping the submarine into the water. Captain Krech then described seeing the dark shape of what he referred to as a strange beast climbing out of the ocean and onto the boat. All of the men began to fire upon the huge creature with sidearms. The beast was hard to make out in the night, but was said to have had a strong grip on the U-boat's forward gun mount. Captain Krech stated that the creature was so big it was rocking the ship as it pulled on the gun. He also recounted seeing the ship's open hatch and feared it was at risk of filling with water. He ordered his men to continue the attack on the monster. Eventually, it let go of the gun turret, its hulking shape sinking back into the dark sea. Krech stated that during the struggle the submarine had been damaged, rendering it unable to submerge. Along with Captain Krech, the separate accounts of each crew member were recorded by the British Navy, all recounting the same set of events. The UB-85 was then cleared and destroyed by the Coreopsis. In 2016, Scottish engineers discovered an underwater shipwreck while laying an undersea power line near Stranraer. After further investigation, it was apparent that they had very likely found the forgotten wreckage of the UB-85. Still rife with damage and decay from the day it was destroyed, the U-boat's fatal wounds were difficult to assess. Was it all caused by the final blow by the Coreopsis? Or could this wreckage be a genuine piece of evidence that proves the existence of sea monsters? Even with these compelling cases rooted in history, the world doesn't appear to be any closer to truly accepting the plausibility of a sea monster's existence. But how many eyewitness accounts does it take to turn the tide? In Cornwall, sightings of a 20-foot-long snake-like creature date back to over a century ago. Apparently dark-skinned and with a humped back, this mysterious amphibian has been labeled as Cornwall's very own Nessie and given the name Morgawr, Cornish for sea giant. It is believed that this creature lives in deep waters just beyond Falmouth Bay and has terrified dozens of eyewitnesses. The earliest suspected encounter took place around 150 years ago, when a long-necked beast was momentarily caught by fishermen in Garrans Bay. Ever since, a similar creature has been spotted all across Cornwall, appearing just off Port Isaac in 1935, and regularly the mouth of the Helford River. Many sightings have placed the beast between Rosemullion Head and Toll Point. This area has subsequently been nicknamed Morgawr's Mile. Could all these witnesses be wrong? One of the most hair-raising events involving a suspected sea monster also took place in Cornwall, on Porthgwarra Beach, September 14th, 1786. Recorded in the Hereford Journal newspaper later that year, an article simply entitled "Sea Monster" described how two local boys looking for shipwrecks stumbled across an enormous hulk near the shore. Horrified by their findings, the two boys soon found a group of local men who followed them to the alleged creature. They too were astonished by the discovery and went on to sound the alarm to the rest of the town. The article read, "A great number of people soon collected themselves into a body and determined to go armed. Some with large sticks and pokers, others with hatchets and spits. The mob climbed down onto the beach and encircled the creature warily, but surprisingly it appeared to be alive." The article reported, "All were alarmed, some stood their ground, others, possessed of greater fear, turned back. They could see no legs to it, but it appeared to crawl on its belly, raising its body at times a little from the sand." The array of witnesses gave detailed descriptions of the animal, with the article reporting, "From the top of its head to the end of its tail, 48 feet, and its circumference in the largest part of the body to be 24 feet. Its head was described as prickly and not formed much unlike that of a man, referring to its facial configuration, albeit with greenish eyes." The newspaper article said that various were the opinions about this creature. Some said it was a mermaid, others a whale, but a greater number disbelieving the existence of the former and adhering to the improbability of the latter, were all equally at a loss. As the incident unfurled and the dying creature desperately tried to crawl back to the sea, the locals agreed that allowing this creature to exist in the surrounding waters would be detrimental to their way of life. Instead, they decided that further examination would be more beneficial to them. The group then launched their attack, using their pokers and hatchets to slash and puncture the creature. It was reported that its back was hard and more difficult to penetrate than the shell of a turtle, and after an hour's beating, stabbing it, it expired with a groan. After the brutality subsided, the details and dimensions of the creature were logged, but what happened to the beast after that point is not entirely clear. The newspaper article suggested it has been used to produce a large quantity of oil, and its fins and shell were sold at a considerable value. The 1786 newspaper article summarized the encounter, writing, "No one that has seen it knows its name, nor has any monster like it ever been described in record, or come within the knowledge of this kingdom." Is this what an animal of such rarity deserves? To be brutally cut up and sold to mildly better the welfare of a small community? And is this simply another example of human beings once again reverting to mob mentality because of their ingrained fear of the unknown? These sea creatures will always be considered monsters to us if we never attempt to bridge the gap in our understanding, to coexist in the way that we do with other dangerous animals. But sadly, this may be an opportunity forever missed, because if these magnificent creatures did exist, the selfish, fearful, and ignorant reactions from people at the time destroyed these rare chances to learn and ultimately discovered the truth. It is unfortunate that the dire events that took place on Porthgwarra Beach in the 18th century perfectly reflect the devastating division between man and sea. It is hard to comprehend the fear of a sailor being caught in such an unforgiving sea, especially after their only form of security has disappeared into the deep beneath them. When such devastation occurs, survivors are few and far between. But one tale in Kent questions whether survival is always better than a quick death. This tale takes us to the small town of Faversham and the 17th century pub called the Shipwrights Arms.
I was the landlady of the Shipwrights for a few years. I knew the rumours of the resident apparitions, but always thought it added to the quirky charm of the pub. The ghostly Jack Tar who haunts the place always filled me with a jovial sense of pride, celebrating the building's rich seafaring history. Until one night, when I woke to a banging on the front door. It was so late, and I was anxious as anything. I crept through the pub, and the banging became more violent. I called out for whoever it was to leave, but no one answered. The banging just continued. It took me a good few minutes to muster up the courage to open the door. As soon as I did, the banging stopped. There was no one there. The wind was so cold, I went back inside and back up the stairs in trepidation, back into my bed. My heart stopped pounding and I felt exhausted. Within 10 seconds, I was asleep. I don't know for how long, but soon the overwhelming smell of tar, rum and tobacco hit my nostrils. Then I saw him, standing at the foot of my bed, the dark silhouette of a sailor, his eyes glowing red, staring down at me.
The former landlady will go on to experience this multiple times during her time managing the Shipwrights' Arms, and she is not the only one said to have encountered the sinister spirit. Other landlords and staff have had similar experiences, with banging on the door to the pub and the usual and sudden smell of tar, often combined with a drop in temperature. It is also said that in a small room beside the bar, customers have seen the bearded phantom suddenly entering and then evaporating in front of their very eyes. However, the most frightening instance involved another former landlord named Barry Testa, who claimed that in the dead of night, after sensing a presence in the room, he felt the apparition climb into his bed. After a few horrific seconds, the entity vanished. But who was this elusive spirit, and what was his story? It is thought that the man was in fact a captain of a 19th century ship that sank just offshore. The captain managed to survive and made his way across the mudflats, dragging his injured body towards the hanging lamps of the Shipwrights Inn, far off in the distance. With hypothermia and severe exhaustion setting in, he reached the cottage and desperately banged on the door. But as it was such a late hour, the owner simply shouted at him to go away. The next morning, the owner woke to find the sailor dead on his doorstep. Ironically, the owner's actions to deter a stranger resulted in him becoming a permanent resident. Although the sinister presence of the red-eyed Jack Tar continues to strike fear into those who encounter him, the real tragedy is of a man who went through hell on the high seas, to survive with sheer will and determination, to battle through pain and suffering, crawling through marshlands to get to a place of refuge, only to fall victim to human indecency. Now to this day he continues to bang on the door hoping to be let inside, looking upon those in bed with envy, hoping to lay his head down to rest one final time.
The sea was looking quite choppy and the sky couldn't make its mind up. One moment the sun was out and within seconds it was gone behind the clouds again. I was out with my dog on our usual stroll along the coastal path. He likes to sniff around the coves, searching for his prized bit of driftwood, probably from some wreck. We began to walk down into the cove at Porthgwarra when I spotted someone down by the shore. I mean, it was hard to see from that distance, but I could make out the hair, almost a golden colour. I thought nothing of it and continued on down. When I looked again, I was drawn to what she was wearing, an old-fashioned dress like out of a Jane Austen novel. The constant changing sunlight gave the cove a strange duality. When I looked again, it suddenly seemed that the woman was now staring back at me. Her face was in shadow, but I could feel her eyes were fixed on me. I felt incredibly unnerved, but I couldn't turn away. It was as if all the noise around me had been drowned out. My dog's bark jolted me. When I looked again, the woman was gone. I hurried home with shivers on repeat up and down my spine. The thing that bothered me most was a deep feeling of overwhelming sadness growing in the pit of my stomach. I didn't know what to make of the experience. All I knew is that as soon as I got home, I would find my husband, and hold him tightly in my arms.
The cove at Porthgwarra captures both beauty and mystery in equal measure. For centuries, the location has been associated with a particularly haunting legend. Its earliest interpretation, predating the 19th century, is from a fragmented copy of verses entitled The Tragedy of Sweet William and Fair Nancy. Nancy was the daughter of a local farmer who became infatuated with a young sailor called William. She was utterly taken by William's gallant stories of his travels, reveling in the discovery and wonder that came with sailing the high seas. The pair quickly began a passionate relationship, but were forced to keep it a secret from their disapproving parents. Sometime later, and much to Nancy's dismay, William was set to go away on another voyage. The night before, they met in secret at the cove and vowed to marry when William returned. In the weeks after he left, Nancy was regularly distraught and would often pace around the cove at the nearby cliffs, spending days watching and waiting anxiously. Her family and locals were deeply concerned for her well-being, worried that she might even attempt to take her own life. Sometime later on a cold winter's night, Nancy heard a pebble tap at her window. She gazed out to see a dark figure down below, staring up at her. Moonlight then illuminated his face. Her lover William had returned. He said softly, "Sleepest thou, sweetheart? Awaken and come hither. My boat awaits us at the cove. Thou must come this night, or never be my bride." The haunting request was also heard by Nancy's aunt, Prudence, who shared the room. Looking out of the window, she saw the sailor himself, just under, dripping wet and deathly pale. When she looked back, Nancy was gone. Charging after her, Prudence exited the house and ran down the lane towards the cove. She could see the lovers ahead but could not catch up to them, for they seemed to glide down the rocky pathway leading to Porthgwarra as if borne on the wind. As Prudence reached the cove, William and Nancy were down below passing over the rocks towards a small boat. The waves crashed around them as a thick fog rolled in. Prudence called out to the lovers, but they seemed completely unfazed. They reached the boat and embraced tenderly. At this moment, a tremendous wave enveloped them. The mist cleared away. Bright moonlight again shone on the water, but the boat and lovers had disappeared. The next day, upon learning of the peculiar chain of events, William's father told Prudence that he too had received a visit from his son earlier in the night. About midnight he saw William at his bedside. Looking ghastly pale, he stayed but a moment and merely said, "Farewell, father and mother. I am come for my bride and must hasten away," when he vanished like a spirit. Later that day, the father received the news that William's ship had sank in a deadly storm weeks before, and its entire crew lay dead at the bottom of the sea. As tragic as this tale might be, perhaps there is optimism to be found in the notion that ultimately love will overcome any obstacle, even death. Today, the legendary spot has since come to be known as the Sweetheart's Cove. The romantic imagery that the ocean often displays is undeniable, and best summed up by the most iconic sea-based mythological creature, the mermaid. This staple of maritime folklore is a belief widely instilled in the superstitions and traditions of coastal communities. When one utters the word mermaid, the image we're most likely manifesting is that of the sweet and innocent aquatic creature with the head and upper body of a female human and the tail of a fish. This magical and beautiful creature was popularized by the 1837 depiction in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. However, in Christian culture, mermaids have often been a symbol of vanity, with many depictions showing the creatures gazing at their own reflection. But what of the monstrous side that hides beneath the surface? The origins of mermaids in the West are thought to have been influenced by the sirens of early Greek mythology and the works of the epic author Homer. Originally half bird-like, the siren would use its hypnotic singing to lure nearby sailors to their deaths. In Greek myths, sirens were companions of the character Persephone, and were given wings to find her after she was kidnapped by Hades. They later came to be depicted as half fish-like around the world in the Christian era. Many cultures have various versions of this creature, such as the Selkies in Norse mythology, or in ancient Japan, the terrifying folklore of ningyos. These challenge the alluring image of sirens, instead depicting a far more monstrous-looking creature, with often sharp teeth and horns. It was thought that catching a ningyo would result in terrible misfortune, and if one washed up on the shores, it was said to be an omen of war and disaster. In many coastal towns, a fear of mermaids has grown over centuries of myths and folklore. In Padstow, Cornwall, an old tale goes that once a mermaid was fired upon by locals and proceeded to block the entrance to the harbour with a wall of sand. Another story in Brockwea, Gloucestershire, saw a fishing boat accidentally injure a mermaid, who proceeded to threaten the fisherman's family, saying, "Very few of your descendants will die in their beds," leading to mysterious deaths for many of the fishermen's relatives. However, of all these tales, one of the most haunting instances takes place in Conwy, Wales, which is said to be cursed by a vengeful mermaid. Legend has it that a group of fishermen were in the estuary when a creature became caught up in their nets. As they hauled their prize catch aboard their boat, they discovered it to be a mermaid. In awe of the rarity of their find, they decided to parade her through the streets of the town. While gasping for air, she begged to be released back to the water. While fascinated townsfolk gazed on in wonder, the mermaid slowly and painfully suffocated. Onlookers recalled in her final breaths that she put a curse on the town, promising catastrophe in its buildings and diseases on future generations. Many believe that the mermaid's curse struck in 1966, when Conwy Civic Hall, supposedly the site of the mermaid's death, was engulfed in flames and destroyed, As the fire raged, locals claimed to have heard the mermaid's haunting laughter amidst the sound of the flames. The tale has a few iterations. One version is attached to a sad and sinister old rhyme describing the mermaid's final moments.
The stranded mermaid on the beach did sorely cry and sorely screech. Afraid to bide the morrow's breeze, the cold it came, and she did freeze.
Another tale of evil from the depths of the sea? Or perhaps another horrifying example of a majestic creature being stripped of its beauty and destroyed by those on land. History and literature strongly point to these mythical sea creatures as being a creation of man, a reflection of the dominant ideas and superstitions of the time. To many, cases of humanoid-like beings that live and breathe in the ocean would seem to be non-existent. However, one case in particular might break everything we think we know about the mermaid lore, or in this instance, merman, taking us to Suffolk, England in the 12th century, and the compelling historical account of the wildman of Orford. It is said that in the late 1100s, the small coastal village of Orford was rocked by an eerie encounter with an abnormal being that supposedly bridged the gap between man and sea. The oldest and most reliable account of this tale was documented in 1200 by an abbot, Ralph of Coggeshall, a mere 30 years after the incident was said to have taken place.
In the time of King Henry II, when Bartholomew de Glanville was castellan of the castle of Orford, it happened that some fishermen who were fishing in the sea caught a wildman in their nets. At this, the castellan of Orford was lost in wonder. The wildman was completely naked. All his limbs were formed like those of a man. He was hairy, and his beard was long and pointed. Around the chest he was very rough and shaggy. The castellan placed him under guard day and night and would not allow him to return to the sea. He eagerly ate anything that was brought to him. He devoured fish raw rather than cooked, squeezing the raw fishes in his hands until all the moisture was removed before eating them. He did not wish to talk, or rather, he did not have the power to talk, even when suspended by his feet and tortured.
With no fishtail or magical powers, this is certainly far from the fairy tale image of merfolk that we have come to know. But what if this was closer to the truth behind the myth? If so, the evolution of such tales and interpretations would certainly make sense. This mysterious being also holds some similarities with another mythical creature of medieval Europe, the woodwoes. These woodland roaming creatures began to appear, carved in the stone of English churches, during the 12th century. Supposedly deaf to the word of God, and were even thought to partake in the snatching and eating of children. Physically, this may seem closer to the wildman of Orford, but aquatic abilities are less common in woodwoes mythology, making this particular variation all the more intriguing. The 12th century Lord Bartholomew was determined to learn more about the suspected merman. He furthered his investigation, leading the wildman to church to see whether God or religion would speak to him. The wildman, however, showed no sign of recognition or belief. The Lord later ordered him to be taken to the harbor to see how he would fare in being returned to the water. They placed 3 lines of very strong nets all around him. The wildman was elated to be reunited with his natural habitat, swimming impressively as if it was second nature. The guards were surprised when he dived deep into the water and appeared outside of their barrier nets. This caused a stir among the local onlookers, who had gathered to witness the unusual beast. As the guards attempted to recapture him, the wildman would dive under the water and emerge a short time later, as if mocking or playing with them. After all hope of recovering him was lost, much to everyone's surprise, the wildman came back to the shore of his own accord. There is a sense in Ralph's report that the wildman did in some ways appreciate his time in the castle, resting from sunset to sunrise, and remained in the castle for 2 months. One day, whilst exercising in the harbor, the wildman performed the same trick with vanishing into the water and emerging outside of the nets. However, this time he ventured back into the open sea and was never seen again. After facing the harsh and sometimes barbaric attitudes of man, on the edge of fear and confusion, the creature never developed a hatred for his captors. On the contrary, in some ways the creature appreciated the place to rest his head, the food to eat, and exercise that was granted to him. With all the wildman's human characteristics, in this instance he perfectly embodies the conflict between man and sea, with opposite worlds attempting to understand the other's way of life. Ultimately both failed, one in his investigation to gather any real answers about the sea dweller, and the other in finding satisfaction in the more civilized way of life on land. Ralph of Coggeshall summarized the encounter, writing,
Whether he was some sort of mortal man, or the evil spirit inside the body of a drowned man, or whether he was some fish in human form, it is not easy to tell.
It is widely agreed that this historical account, given by a credible figure, is very likely rooted in truth, the remnants of which can still be found today, etched into the stone of the surrounding churches. This twisted relationship between man and sea rises and falls like the tide. From the romantic light we cast upon the spectacle of the glistening water, to the menace we dread, lingering in the dark depths of the abyss. In many ways, the sea is the greatest reminder of our limitations as a race, that some things can never be conquered, and some mysteries can never be explained. We will forever be on the edge of the shoreline, gazing out in fear and wonder at the place we will never walk.